very good evening to all the dignitaries, guests, and delegates present here. I, Shreya Basu, along with my co host Ashik Ameshwar, the youth ambassadors and the research coordinators of GCTC, feel extremely privileged to extend our warm welcome to all present here for the event, International Day of Standing in Solidarity with the Victims of Terrorism, organized by GCTC. Now, we would like to officially commence this event with a small quote by Malala Yousafzai, which holds immense significance, which goes like, with guns, you can kill terrorists. With education, you can kill terrorism. Somehow, our fight against terror and terrorism seems to be an ongoing one, but we haven't lost hope and we won't.
Terrorism is evidently the most potent and widespread threat faced by global community. It has widely been accepted that religion, ideological and geopolitical differences cannot justify the use of terror, irrespective of perceived or even actual injustice that may have been faced by a community or a country. Past efforts at forging a cohesive and a unified response to global and regional terrorism have been met with mixed results, despite making perceptible progress in achieving better coordination.
This event will provide an overview on the state of the victims of terrorism and urge the international community to strengthen their rights and address their needs even during global health emergencies. It seeks to build and consolidate these efforts and translate them into practical and sustainable actions at the national level, sharing the way forward on national and cross border commemoration efforts. It must strive for developing comprehensive national assistance plans that address the need of the victims. The primary responsibility to support the victims and uphold their rights rests with the member states. The UN has an important role in supporting the member states to implement the Pillar 1 and 4 of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy through standing in solidarity and providing support to victims, capacity building assistance, and offering support to civil society organizations, particularly victims of terrorism associations.
We at GCTC strive to enhance international peace by promoting counter-terrorism strategies and helping in coordinating global efforts in combating this menace. Being a global think tank which engages with personas of repute as well as the youths of today, it is our humble efforts to engage with such victims of terror from around the globe, and in order to re-energize global resolve to fight terrorism and draw inspiration from the stories of inspirational personalities. I would like to request Dr. Shekhar Dutt, Global Counter-Terrorism Council, for delivery of opening remarks by GCTC.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm extremely sanguine that this discussion would enable to throw lights on many things about how terrorism has affected people and achieved no result for which the terrorists wanted to fight for what they think is a cause. But it has brought in a huge amount of misery to the people, including their own kind. In fact, over a period of years when I was working both in the Defense Ministry and elsewhere, the world has changed, and from small skirmishes to regular wars, terrorism never played any part of settling a dispute. So sometime in 1980s, this was initiated by not terrorists, but by practitioners who fight the normal war, that means the army, and that was from our neighbor. And this whole whole thing came about that through terrorism you could achieve a goal, even if it is to clear the path of what was considered to be getting rid of the Soviets from Afghanistan, so clear the path. And they use terrorism, and they use also a slogan of religious terrorism. I have seen at different places all these kind of tactics were resorted by people or organizations who were inherently weak themselves, who did not have the means to fight for a cause, who did not have, in fact, any cause itself. And if you don't have, and you try to enable the people to, or to try to justify in front of them that what you are doing is correct, this results in what is known as terrorism. Terrorism has been the tool of groups of people aided and abetted by some of the uh, governments which have different reasons to put the terrorists in the fore. So after a while, successive incidents happened after 1980s, and we had embassy bombing, London tube bombing, and many other things, and finally the spectacular 9/11. India has been victim of terrorism also for a fairly long time from that period onwards. And I can assure you that none of the people who have led the terrorists into doing these kind of terrorism, acts of terrorism, have achieved whatever they wanted to do. Now, what does the terrorism incident leave? That incident actually leaves a very large number of absolutely innocent victims who have no reasons to be victimized like that. In fact, some of them were bystanders, some of them had no reason to be attacked by the terrorists, and yet they are the ones who become the victims. Therefore, we have to actually, the civil society, the military society, the state has to actually try and simulate conditions to see which will lead on to these kind of terrorist activities so that we can prevent the terrorism act to happen. And there is no shortcut to that. In fact, many times, and during this pandemic, we were talking at different forum, and I said that just like eternal vigilance is the price of freedom, eternal carefulness is the price of health. And a similar thing exists, eternal vigilance, in order to ensure that an act of terrorism is not committed and innocent people do not become victims of terrorism. I wish all the people who are participating in this a very good discussion, and I already see my former colleague, very distinguished person, Mr. Kamal Sibal here, and Mahavir Singhvi from the Foreign External Affairs Ministry. I'm sure that we will have an extremely good discussion. Thank you very much. We must pledge ourselves that we will, at any time, if we find that a possible act of terrorism has been conducted or is going to be conducted, we have to be alert and we have to play our own role to prevent that. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. Those were really kind words, and for your special remarks, thank you again. We are really honored to have you here. Now, I would like to request all for a minute of silence, remembering the victims of terrorism. Thank you, everyone. I would like to invite Dr. Kaval Sibal, Chairman Advisory Board at GCTC and former Foreign Secretary, Government of India, to share a few words with us.
Well,
Yes, sir.
well, thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words. The whole issue of terrorism is deeply important for India. I have been of the view that if you look at the depth, extent, and duration of sufferings from terrorism of any country, then India, in fact, has been the biggest victim of terrorism. You know, in the case of other countries who have suffered terrorism, no doubt, but there is no state that acknowledges, accepts, and is involved in the promotion of terrorism against another state. You have a lot of violence, a lot of terrorism in West Asia, for instance. But is there any state in West Asia which officially says that it is supporting these forces? The only country in the world that does that is Pakistan. There's a lot of accusation against Iran by the Americans that is the biggest sponsor of terrorism. But the Iranian government has never officially accepted that terrorism is a legitimate instrument for advancing their political goals. Now, so long as we have Pakistan committed to sponsorship of terrorism against India, it can raise the bar, it can lower the bar depending on the international situation and what they feel may be the openings for them. It's a different matter. But they will not give up terrorism, and we now see in Jammu and Kashmir, they're trying very hard to promote violence if they can. They face some hurdles in terms of clampdown on social media and everything else. And of course, after Balakot, they are a bit careful about the terrorist strikes of a certain dimension, because they fear there may be some strong reaction from the Indian side. That's one. The other is that India essentially has been alone in this battle. One can talk in general in terms of the international community, but the international community, although it accepts that terrorism is a global phenomenon and that all countries should join hands together to combat it, it should not be seen as the problem of an individual country. But in actual fact, there is no global solidarity in terms of combating terrorism. Now, India in the 90s had sponsored an international agreement on combating international terrorism, a UN agreement on combating international terrorism. Recently, in our joint statements with a lot of countries, including some Arab countries, there is support for this international convention on countering terrorism. But in actual fact, on the ground, nothing has moved. The problem in the past, and remains, I think, to some extent, is that there is always an argument that a distinction has to be made between terrorism and a freedom struggle. The kind of argument that Pakistan also uses, but an argument which the Palestinians and their supporters and the Islamic countries were using for a long time. Because of the definition, problem of defining terrorism and differences between countries on how terrorism should be defined, there hasn't been that kind of an international covenant to combat terrorism. Certainly, there are huge double standards when it comes to dealing with terrorism. And I make this point to our American friends that you say Iran is the biggest supporter of international terrorism, but look at Pakistan. the number of people, your own soldiers that they have killed in Afghanistan. At one time, one of their chiefs, the chief of Joint Chiefs of Staff, in a congressional testimony, said openly that the Haqqani group is an arm of the ISI. But when it comes to sanctions, Iran has been squeezed to the bone, but there are hardly any sanctions on Pakistan. So Pakistan is escaping. There is some now effort to control the funding and of terrorism, in particular money laundering and all that, through the FATF mechanism. And this FATF mechanism it has proved useful in terms of putting pressure on Pakistan to inside its own country block the funding and financial sources of terrorism. But there again, Pakistan is feeling the heat, but there is a reluctance to blacklist it. And Pakistan has now found new friends in China and in Turkey and in Malaysia who protect Pakistan from being blacklisted by the FATF. India and United States have started cooperating better than in the past in terms of helping us forensically and in other ways to deal with the issues of terrorism as they arise, some degree of intelligence sharing. But to what extent this is satisfactory, I'm not sure, because I think it is still below the threshold that we would want to reach. Finally, with Afghanistan, developments in Afghanistan, and America actually negotiating with the Taliban and reviving Pakistan's role in Afghanistan is a dangerous signal for us, because we know what the Taliban is, what its commitment to terrorism is, and what is an obscurantist force with a particular mindset, and it's deeply linked to the Pakistani deep establishment. So we have to be watchful that developments in Afghanistan, in connivance with Pakistan, should not pose additional challenges to us in terms of dealing with the issue of terrorism. And finally, how is terrorism? How does terrorism grow? It is growing in madrasas. It is growing in mosques. It is growing through the social media by some extremely conservative mullahs. This financing that still comes from West Asia. So a great deal of introspection has to be done by the Islamic world in general about how this increased terrorism, now represented by the Islamic State and all this thing about the caliphate, is going to destabilize the West Asian countries themselves. Fortunately, countries like UAE and Saudi Arabia have begun to understand this and are cooperating with us, and which is a signal success of the government's foreign policy, that it has got these conservative regimes to actually cooperate with us in terms of some of our terrorist concerns, and actually even hand back to us, repatriate some figures which we need for interrogation, which is a good thing. But the problem is bigger than this, and this whole de-radicalization process that people talk about is a very slow process. It's a very complicated process. And at what stage in the process of de-radicalization we begin interfering with what the conservative Islamic lobbies would feel is an interference in the religious practices, is a very delicate ground. And one has to be very careful about control over madrasas, control over what is said in the mosques in terms of sermons and this and that. So a huge battle in front of us. And finally, in terms of victims of terrorism, the victims of terrorism have to be looked after by national governments. There's no international fund that you can dip into because there's no international consensus on terrorism and responsibility for terrorism. So ultimately, our own government, and in our case, the Indian government, has to look after the unfortunate victims of terrorism as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your enlightened words. And your enlightened words would always enshrine in our hearts. It was a pleasure listening to you. Now it's an honor and privilege to invite Sri Mahavir Singhvi, Joint Secretary, Counter-Terrorism, Ministry of External Affairs, for his kind and thinker words in this field.
Thank you. Former Governor and Patron of GCTC, Dr. Shekhar Dutt, former Foreign Secretary of India, Dr. Kaval Sibal, UN Resident Coordinator in Kenya, Major Siddharth Chatterjee, Mr. Aditya Tikku, victims and survivors of terrorism and their representative. So good evening. Let me thank GCTC first of all for inviting me as a speaker for this webinar to show our solidarity with victims of terrorism. As we all know, that 21st August has been designated by the United Nations an International Day of Remembrance of and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism. And this is the third commemoration of this day. And on this day, my deepest sympathies to all the innocent victims and their families who have seen their happiness tragically cut short due to the ruthless atrocities of terrorism. As my speakers earlier have said, that terrorists use violence to further their nefarious objectives. They do it, but they can never succeed in achieving their goals. But they leave behind a trail of death and destructions, punctuated by pain and suffering of innocent victims. This is an occasion for somber reflection and introspection on the path we must choose to put an end to such suffering due to terrorism. Both the speakers have earlier talked about how India has been the victim of state-sponsored cross-border terrorism from Pakistan, which were aimed at creating disturbance in our territory. Terrorist attacks, provocative speeches, infiltration attempts, smuggling of weapons and narcotics were regularly used by and are regularly used by Pakistan as a tool of statecraft to create an atmosphere of fear and intimidation inside the Indian territory. Pakistan, on the other hand, continues to deny the victims of terrorism their fundamental right to justice by not acting on the concrete evidences which have been shared by India on several terrorist attacks, including the 1993 Mumbai serial blast and the 2008 Mumbai terror attacks. The perpetrators of these gruesome terror attacks have been proscribed by the UNSC 1267 committee, but continue to enjoy state hospitality in Pakistan. They are still to be apprehended and sentenced. Families who lost their loved ones are still suffering and waiting for justice to be delivered. At this International Day of Terrorism, when we are remembering the victims of terrorism, I think we need to hear the stories of the various victims who have been, have suffered in terms of everything, their lives, their families, their children, their wealth, everything. So we keep on hearing the stories of terrorist attacks around the world, but at the same time, we hardly get to hear the stories of victims and survivors of terrorist attacks. The stories of their families, friends, and communities who have suffered long after their loved ones are gone and harmed often go untold. They silently bear the burden of terrorism throughout their entire lives, even spanning across generations. Victims of such horrendous crime of terrorism are ordinary innocent women and playful children, attending schools, visiting markets, taking parts in religious ceremonies, or attending concerts and sporting events. They become simply a statistical number for the record, and the world moves on, ignoring or forgetting the victims and their families once the immediate aftermath of terrorist attacks fade, can have profound consequences. Traumatic memories like these can never be forgotten or erased, but families can be held with truth and swift justice. Every one of us and the international community, therefore, as a whole, has the responsibility to stand in solidarity with victims, provide them psychological and financial assistance, and facilitate in the normalization of their lives. The formation of the group of Friends of Victims of Terrorism by the United Nations and the establishment of the International Day of Remembrance of and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism on 21st August, that is today, are important steps in this direction. The virtual Counter-Terrorism Week, which was organized by the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism in July 2020, had a specific discussion on how to keep the momentum going while strengthening the rights of victims during this pandemic. Further avenues of assistance for international cooperation on supporting the victim of terror were also discussed. A pertinent theme is about developing sustainable measures to promote voices of survivors of terrorism and their important role in countering terrorist narratives. I believe healing process cannot start unless we recognize and uphold the rights of victims and their survivors. It is important to provide support and assistance to the aggrieved families and communities at the same time. It is also paramount to strengthen their voices and role in preventing and countering violent extremism that often form the basis of terrorist attacks and acts. The narrative of hatred has to be challenged, and having platform to amplify the voices of victims and their survivor is very much important. Due to COVID-19 pandemic, many countries have diverted resources to tackle the multiple crises emerging out of the pandemic. This has delayed criminal justice procedures and restricted access to psychological, legal, and financial support for the victims. It is therefore important to have a dialogue with the victims to bring out their struggle to the forefront, making their courage and resilience a lesson and inspiration to all of us. I thank the GCTC for organizing this interactive session with the victims and their representatives. The need of the victims of terror survivors, families, and communities vary over the length of time. Civil societies organizations such as GCTC can help in developing effective measures to not only recognize, assist, and support the voices of victims, but also to collaborate with authorities to raise awareness about their struggle. Such organizations can also help in evaluating the impact of terrorist acts on the victims and their families. I am committed against them is also extremely important, as I mentioned earlier. So in the acts of terror acts on the victims, the central scheme for assistance to civilian victims of terrorists on Indian territory gives compensation up to rupees 5 lakhs to victims of terrorism. In addition, those permanently incapacitated and members of the families of the victims killed are entitled to get a health card, which are given under the National Rural Health Mission. This entitles the card holders to free medical treatment in respect of injuries and all other major illnesses caused due to violence. Government of India also has a welfare scheme under this. Seats in the medical colleges are kept reserved for the kins of victims of terrorism under the well-defined and transparent process. National Foundation of Communal Harmony, under its project Assist, provides financial assistance for the children of victims of terrorism to pursue their education in higher educational institutions. Last but not the least, I would like to reiterate once again that we all must continue our commitment to help the victims of terrorism get over their trauma, recognize their dignity and right to a normal life, and assist them in navigating towards a more positive outlook in life. Thank you once again for inviting me for this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for sharing your deep knowledge with us. We are glad to have your presence here.
It's our honor and privilege to invite our next speaker, retired Major Siddharth Chatterjee, Sena Medal, Gallantry Award winner, currently the UN Research Coordinator and in Kenya, to enlighten us with his views. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, and it's an absolute honor to be in the company of Shekhar Dutt, a former soldier, Sena Medal for Gallantry in the 1971 war. Kapil Sibal, we know him, Kamal Sibal, we know him very well. Mr. Sibal, I had the pleasure of working with Mani Dixit back in Sri Lanka. I organized his security at the Indian High Commission in Colombo. And of course, Mr. Mahavir Singhvi. You will have to forgive me for my bluntness in this particular conversation because I come from two perspectives. One, as a frontline special forces officer of the Indian Army in the space of countering violent extremism and terrorism. And secondly, as the head of the United Nations in Kenya, a country that continues to suffer from the scourge of terror attacks from across its borders. So let me start with a quote from the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres. And he says, number one, we must put prevention first. That echoes precisely to what Mr. Shekhar Dutt said at the very beginning of this conversation. The international community has every right to defend against this threat using lawful means. But we must pay careful attention to addressing the causes of violent extremism and terror if this problem is to be resolved in the long run. There is no single pathway to violent extremism and terror. But we know that extremism flourishes when human rights are violated, political space is shrunk, aspirations for inclusion are ignored, and too many people, especially young people, lack prospects and meaning in their lives. As we have seen in Syria and Libya and elsewhere, violent extremists make unresolved and prolonged conflicts even more intractable. So that is perhaps an entry point with which I want to take this conversation further. Now, what is the United Nations trying to do about this in terms of the entire prevention agenda? So in consultation with the entire group of member states, the UN has, led by a very able Russian Undersecretary General by the name of Ambassador Voronko, who leads the Office of Counter-Terrorism at the United Nations in New York. And basically the outline is we will provide every form of support to member states and regional organizations, particularly in a broad range of prevention and the countering of violent extremism issues, namely developing national and regional prevention of countering violent extremism strategies and action plans, prevention of radicalization to violence in prisons, and rehabilitation and reintegration of violent extremist offenders, strategic communications to promote alternative and counter-terrorist narratives, engaging and empowering youth for the prevention of and countering of violent extremism, strengthening the role of parliamentarians in the space of prevention of countering violent extremism, and leveraging sports and their values. And I think these are very, very important issues that the UN is trying to confront through this whole modus operandi of looking at the entire angle of prevention as precisely the first step. Let me state this quite bluntly. I'm a Sri Lanka veteran, and I went and fought there for 2.5 years. Sri Lanka represents a failure of politics, a failure of dialogue, a failure of not allowing the political dimensions to have the overriding perspective of managing a peace there. And I spent 2.5 years there in the front lines as part of the Indian peacekeeping forces. We came back bruised as an army. We came back quite humiliated. And we came back struggling, trying to understand the first reasons that we were sent into that particular conflict. I've had very open and lengthy discussions with Mani Dixit when he wrote this book on Sri Lanka. In fact, if you open that book, he actually posted 2 or 3 of my pictures in that book as a combat soldier. But the issue is that belligerence has not answered that question. And I go back to that issue that the Secretary General has already raised. Everything has been thrown into Syria. Everything has been thrown into Afghanistan. The mightiest powers have worked in Iraq. I served in Iraq right at the time of the surge from 2007 to 2009. And I'm reminded of the words of General William Sherman, who once said that it is only those who've neither fired a shot nor heard the shrieks and groans of the wounded who cry aloud for blood, more vengeance and more desolation. Wars are hell. It goes back to the primacy of what I'm trying to talk about. And I think Shekhar would probably know that even better, having served as the governor in Chhattisgarh, a place which sees the scourge of Maoist attacks. Ladies and gentlemen, the dialogue which is right now happening in Afghanistan is happening because soon the most powerful forces realized that they've come to a status quo situation. And I think I would commend President Trump for at least applying the wisdom of not allowing hubris to take over a decision of ending that war, which has just got protracted and protracted, which is quite a clear significance of the application of armed might is not going to resolve violent extremism. We saw that in Northern Ireland. The might and dexterity of the British armed forces could not quell the Irish insurgents. And yet, it was a dialogue which was initiated and hold on aggressive credit of allowing a conversation to take and allowing the primacy of dialogue and mediation to take over rather than sheer kinetic power. So I'm seeing this regularly across within Somalia and in Kenya. And one thing that I've recognized in Kenya, and that's why Kenya was picked last year for the hosting of the global of Africa-wide conference on the prevention of violent extremism, is it has made some very important steps in advancing the prevention agenda. And the UN did what is called a study in Africa on the journey to violent extremism. And there are a few things which came out rather saliently in this. Number 1, poverty. Number 2, disaffection. Number 3, marginalization. Number 4, despondency. Number 5, the heavy-handedness of the state. Complete violation of rights, absence of equality, a deep sense of aggrievement, and therefore this kind of builds up into one which then takes on a life of its own. So there is an issue of injustice, and we have to acknowledge it. We cannot, as a nation state in India, continue to be belligerent and wanting to deal with everything with the sledgehammer of violence. It just doesn't work. I can tell you that after 10 years in the Army Special Forces. So I would hope that the Indian civil service, our Indian political class, start looking at the entire prevention agenda in its real sense. In those young people, India has a median age of 19. That sense of being left behind, that sense of exclusion, that sense of religious intolerance, that absence of pluralism, that sense of absence of secularism, is just a sword of the Damocles looming over our heads. And yet, in India, we have the power, the capacity, the soft power, the projection, the abilities of some of the finest people, leaders like Shekhar Dutt, leaders like Kamal Sibal, who can be out there to change that narrative. Our narrative has become, there's a problem, use the army, bash it down. No. No. We have to allow dialogue. I mean, I'm a father. When my child was born, and as I see him grow up, I see pure innocence. And yet, my father must have had the same experience from me when he saw me grow up. I graduated from the NDA, I went into the IMA, my first combat operation was Sri Lanka. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, when that first bullet was fired, it changed everything in my life. Everything. And I just hope that we have more people like Shekhar Dutt who understand both sides of the horizon, actually enter roles of leadership in the civil service too. It's not enough, Mahavirji, that 9 months in with a military barrack or a cantonment. You need to understand that that Indian soldier who's operating in Kashmir or Nagaland or anywhere else goes through many trials and tribulations. In my own unit, we lost about 15 officers and over 100 men in just a short span of conflicts from Sri Lanka to Nagaland. The point is, each death we celebrate as that of a martyr, as someone who sacrificed his life for the country. I carried back the ashes of the second in command of my battalion to his family. There were broken hearts there. There were dreams that ended right there on the spot. So let's reignite what India really stands for in terms of advancing soft power, in terms of advancing hope, in terms of advancing dialogue. We could probably become the role model of the prevention agenda if we were to apply that with the real sense of a heritage that got left behind in this country. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your views with us, sir. That was some really crucial points highlighted by Major Siddharth Chatterjee. It was a delight hearing you, sir.
Thank you, sir. And now is the time to encourage the spirits. And for that, I would like to introduce you Nicolas Hennen, a French journalist who publishes in written media, radio, and television. A specialist of the Middle East, he has covered the Iraq War and Syrian civil war. He was captured by ISIS in Syria along with 3 other Frenchmen and held hostage for almost a year. After his liberation, Hennen co-founded Action Resilience, a network promoting level-headedness and in anti-terrorism. He became a notable voice in the fight against hate speech. Nicolas Hennen, now I would like to invite you to share a few words with us.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I actually intended to introduce myself, so you allow me to save some time to my presentation. So yes, as you said, I'm both a victim of terrorism myself, or what is usually named a survivor, and also I became very active, and even I made it my life and also my living. I'm doing my living out of counter-terrorism and counter-radicalization. So what I would like to focus on today, because I think it's definitely the day or the opportunity to do it, is to focus first on why it is important to remember victims of terrorism? And the answer is actually quite simple. It is just because the terrorists have tried to make some people disappear, to make their life vanish, they have tried to destroy them and to make like disappear. And to remember a victim, and especially someone who passed away, and as a victim who was not even a survivor, but who was killed during the attack, is a way, is the best or a possible way to make this victim live forever, and therefore to make what the terrorists have tried fail. What is also important is, and something on which I would like really to focus, is the idea of dignity. We too often witness attempt to the dignity of victims of terrorism. And this actually is a continuation of the project of the terrorist, that was also to dehumanize the persons they attack. I would like also to make a short focus on the idea of revenge and to oppose it to the idea of justice. And I will, on this point, only give my point of view. And of course, there is no one can say I embody the voice of a victim of terrorism, or I'm like the ambassador of the victims. No, every victim is different, and we all have different opinions and points of view. But to me, it is very important to focus on the fact that terrorism is a denial of justice, and therefore the best way to answer terrorism is to bring justice back. A victim of terrorism, usually myself, maybe not all of us, but most of those I know, they want justice. They are not looking for revenge. They want peace to come back. They want the end of violence, because revenge looks like justice. It looks like, okay, you have done that. If I do use that, then we will be equal again, and the order will be back. No, actually, revenge is another violence that will call for another violence and therefore call for another one. And this is not the kind of, well, someone who has been a victim of violence will look primarily for an extinction of violence. And justice is a beautiful way to, I'm not saying to pardon or to forgive or to say, okay, it's like you terrorists, you have done nothing and you will go back to the society. No, it's a way to make them pay, but orderly and following rules. And this is extremely important. In France and many Western countries, I know victims are very active in the terrorist trials. They will be heard. They will be offered the opportunity to ask their questions directly to the suspects at the courthouse. And they will find answers. And these trials are considered as an important part of the rehabilitation work, the mental restoration, so to say, of the victim of terrorism. I would like also to say one word about the title in your program of the part of the webinar under which I'm currently intervening. That is, because it says about global war on terrorism. Yes, I do believe there is some global war on terrorism because terrorism affects every single country, every single society. But I disagree with the George Bush way. This term of global war of terrorism has been used because terrorism does affect every society, every country, but terrorism also is embodied through every ideology or through every culture or sect or religion. And you will find terrorism in every culture, country, or religion. And this idea, like of a global war of terrorism, in the way George Bush and others have used it, gives a picture of some kind of global civilizational clash that is actually a recruiting tool for many terrorist ideologies, especially the jihadi one, but not only. And this is something we should be very aware of and be very careful in the way we use it. And I would like to finish with this point, because this point was not accidental. I do believe very much in the prevention work that a victim of terrorism can do. I go myself to prisons in France. I talk to radicalized inmates and I exchange with them. Some of them, by the way, being, well, the returnees from Syria and Iraq. So they were maybe not my captors directly, but friends with them. And I do believe very much in this kind of interactions in order to act at the different steps of prevention: primary, secondary, third prevention. And this is really something I'm willing to advocate for, the fact that a victim of terrorism has a message that is complex, that is plural, to tell to the whole of society, and especially to the part of the society that is especially at risk of going to violent action. Thank you very much again for this invitation. I was extremely honored to be your guest today.
Thank you very much for your reflective experience, and we are really glad to have your presence here. Now, before moving on to the next invitee speaker, I would like to give a brief for Levent Alton. So Levent Alton has been an executive director of Victim Support Europe since November 2014. Before joining Victim Support Europe, he worked as a principal legal advisor at Milieu Limited, a multidisciplinary consultancy. He worked twice for the European Commission as a national expert, and during the time he was responsible for drafting and negotiating the EU directive establishing minimum standards on the rights, support, and protection of victims of crime. Now, I would like to welcome Levent Alton and would like to share the work with us.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, let me thank the Global Counter-Terrorism Council for this kind invitation to speak on such an important day. Certainly, this is a day that allows all of us to remember and honour the thousands of victims who have been harmed or killed by terrorist attacks, and to recognise their sacrifice. And these Memorial Days are essential in the recognition of survivors and in the memory of those who have lost their lives, and are essential also in maintaining our determination to support victims every single day, not just on these Remembrance Days. And what I wanted to do, I think, is just take some time to cover 2 points. Firstly, on the organisation of memorial events, which aren't always so obvious, especially in these difficult times. And secondly, to focus on the rights and support of victims. Just quickly to explain for those of you who don't know, Victim Support Europe is a European and international network. We've been around for 30 years and we have 60 members across 30 countries. And those organizations support around 2 million victims of all different kinds of crime. And we work to advocate to push for policy and law changes and to develop capacity. But since 2015, after the Paris attacks, we've also worked specifically on terrorism issues, trying to help ensure that every victim of terrorism, no matter where that terrorist attack takes place, is able to access the rights and services that they need. So that's a little bit about us. And as an organization working with all victims of crime across Europe and globally, what we've seen is that there are multiple needs of victims. They need recognition, they need respect and dignity, and they need protection, not just from crime and terrorism, but they also need protection from secondary victimization, from the harm we can cause by our interactions with them. And they need justice and compensation. And for victims of terrorism, memory and remembrance days are an essential element of meeting their needs, perhaps even more so than for many of the other kinds of victims of crime. Yet different countries have varying levels of success in how they hold these events. And this is even more difficult having in mind the current global restrictions due to COVID-19. But what we have to ensure is that these memorials have victims at the heart of their preparation, design, and delivery. So to do this, we have to first of all listen to victims about every aspect of the event. That means, where is the event held? Who is invited to speak? Whether the names of victims are read out or not? What any physical memorial should look like? Victims have to be at the heart of that decision-making process, and decision-making is a critical part of it. We have to have a clear, transparent process. It's not enough that victims are simply allowed to provide some input. They actually have to have their views taken into account. I've seen all too often that victims have spoken, asked for something, and it is ignored. And to be honest, that is far more damaging than not even listening to them or asking them in the first place. So the needs of victims during events also have to be paramount. We have to think about the length of event, whether there's seating. I've seen events where victims have had to stand for 2 hours. And I've seen other events where they've been invited to sit front row as honored guests. Obviously, the latter approach makes a huge difference. But we also have to recognize that terrorism affects wide parts of our society who want to come together in solidarity. So we have to use this as an opportunity for solidarity and for building peace. We have to help these different groups to participate as much as possible. We have to ensure that support is available to victims before, during, and after the event. Because it's not enough just to leave victims to their own devices. We need to help them through this process. We need to give them the space to be together, to talk and to reconnect, and to have private moments to come together. And that means, for example, creating a place where the press cannot enter, where they cannot report. And I think the memorial events that we've seen in, for example, France, have been a very good example of this careful, victim-focused approach. Finally, we have to make we have to establish permanent memorials which give voice to victims and the memories of loved ones. So that may be physical memorials, quiet places of contemplation, places where people can pay their respects, but also understand the devastating impact of terrorism. But we can also look to use technologies, online memorials, which tell the stories of victims and which allow their voices to be heard and which are an increasingly effective way of recognizing victims. But memorials are just one part of a puzzle in a victim-centric approach. And it's equally essential that we ensure there are rights and services in place for victims. And I would say, yes, prevention is an absolute priority, but as equally important are these rights and services, because we won't stop terrorism tomorrow. We will not stop it next week or next year. So we have to make sure that the right responses are there for victims when these attacks happen. And this means in particular that every victim should have easy access to support services. These are services which offer them emotional and psychological assistance. These are services that provide practical help, coping with administration, forms, speaking to employers, helping victims to put their lives back together. So, for example, you can bring architects and builders together to adapt the home of a victim in a wheelchair, as they did after the Boston Marathon bombing. Or you can connect victims with the world's best health experts to help them with hearing loss, prosthetics, or the many other highly complicated medical needs that victims of terrorism all too often experience. And all too often they are denied access to these kinds of medical treatments because of the country where they experienced that attack. And we can provide assistance so that victims with life-altering injuries can continue in their existing jobs, or so that they can be trained to enter new jobs. They need every form of support to help them recover and move forward with their lives. Our approach has to be expansive with respect to support. When it comes to terrorism, this assistance isn't essential just for the direct victims, but for the many others impacted: family, friends, businesses, and first responders. The burden that can weigh on our first responders who stopped the terrorists, who tried to help the fallen should not be underestimated. And our services must ensure that these men and women are also taken care of. Let me say, I've too frequently seen the long-term devastating impact on both professional and civilian responders that they suffer, having made life and death decisions about who to help after an attack. These are decisions that weigh heavily on them, and we owe it to them to have the right systems in place to support. So support should be provided both by civil society actors and the state, but it should also be from professional organizations, or not just from professional organizations solely focused on supporting victims. But that support can also be provided by our police, our prosecutors, judges, our businesses, health centers, and schools. We all have a role in supporting victims, but we have to help them understand what their role is and how to carry out that role. So they have to understand what is the impact of terrorism on victims. They have to know how to speak empathetically to them, how to offer help. They need to know how to provide information quickly, regularly, and in different forms so that it is easy to understand. And we mustn't blame the victims. And overall, we have to connect those victims with professional support services. Unfortunately, all too often, our justice system can cause as much harm as the crime itself. And all too often, the process of seeking compensation can be lengthy and painful, with funds arriving too late. Every aspect of our response to a terrorist attack when it comes to victims has to be reviewed and ensured it is victim-focused and victim-friendly. So there's much that can be done. Our actions have to be founded in strong legislation, supported through effective funding. There has to be real action, and there must be collaboration between states, civil society, academia, and the private sector. Without such actions, the impact and relevance of Remembrance Days, our recognition of victims, is diminished. Without such actions, victims will suffer unnecessarily, our communities will suffer unnecessarily, and ultimately our economies will suffer. So let's be clear. Much of these actions can and must take place well ahead of any terrorist attack. We can plan for an attack, and we can ensure that there is a victim focus in all of our responses. By taking these preparatory actions, we can help reduce the terrible impact of terrorism on victims. So on this day of remembrance, I hope that all of you will commit to change, commit to supporting victims wherever they may be and whatever the type of attack. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your insightful experience with us. It indeed was information full of experience. And now over to Shreya.
Thank you. Now I would like to request Mr. Sajid Yusuf, socio-political analyst, lawyer, and a victim of terrorism, to share his experiences as a victim. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much for giving me chance to speak. Basically, I'm from Kashmir, and you must be aware about a lot of things which are going on in the Kashmir Valley. To be very honest with you, just I'm sharing my views with you, which happened with me long back when I was just 8 years old. My mother as well as my uncle was shot dead in front of me by Pakistan-sponsored terrorists in front of me. So it has been almost 16 years. I'm remembering each and every time what happened at that night. Even there are a lot of Kashmiris like me who have lost their loved ones. Some lost their families, some lost their friends in this Pakistan-sponsored terrorists. Even if you check all the news stuffs in the newspapers, whether it's an international or national newspapers, you will find the headline of the Kashmir all the time, because there is a reason behind it. Because Pakistan-sponsored terrorists are killing Kashmiris on the name of jihad. Like my like one of the panelists were talking about many things. I'm completely agree with him that he was talking about the radicalism which is coming from the madrasas and mosques. And other thing is which I want to share with you that in Kashmir, there is an involvement of Pakistan-sponsored terrorists, which world need to think about it, because the thing is it is the India today which is suffering, and it can be tomorrow somebody else. If it is India tomorrow today, and tomorrow it can be somewhere else, and it's the prime responsibility for us of all to ponder over that what is going on. And second thing is, which I want to clear, that if you have seen the reports in the media, and I'm from Srinagar actually, and I know the things which are going on the ground. There and the terrorists which are on the ground, which are killing the local innocent Kashmiris for their political or ideology, and some for their some who are in the police force and security force. They are killing lot of people on the name of jihad. And the thing is, if you see the a lot of news stuff before in 2016, you have seen we have seen from last almost 3 decades from 90s. I'm the myself 90s born, so I will speak after what happened after 90s. The thing is, Pakistan has completely involvement in Pakistan's forces, not only in India but across the world. And the thing is, if you see the many terror outfits which are active in the Kashmir Valley right now, be it whosoever is there, they are actually directly and indirectly supported by the Pakistan. And the thing is, the main organization which we need to discuss here is Jamaat-e-Islami, which has the backbone, which has been always backbone of these Pakistan-sponsored terrorists by financially. They are helping these terror outfits from the financially. And the second thing is, there are a lot of things. For example, when we talk about the terrorism, if you see the reports, that I know many people who are nearby, my friends, who have lost their loved ones just because of this terrorism. And the thing is, one of the panelists were talking about that we should not think about the revenge. But the thing is, like I'm myself a victim of terrorism, I'm not holding any gun. I'm holding a pen. I need to think. I want to write about the terrorism, which made me the victim of this terrorism. But the thing is, when I talk about the terrorism, I'm being targeted by the same evil forces who killed my mother, who killed my uncle. I'm not being allowed even to speak. I'm not even being allowed to write on the death anniversary of my parents. And it's the tragedy of almost I guess it's the tragedy of this state where I am living right now. That the thing is, for example, if I want to share my views, if I want to burst my emotions, which are almost I'm holding from last 16, 17 years, when I was just 8 years old. And the thing is, my mother, she was not associated with anything. She was just a teacher. Even you will see the Kashmiri Pandits, how they got killed on the name of Nizam-ul-Mustafa and other things. And same is the case where it's not only the Kashmiri Pandits who got killed in this conflict, but the thing is the Kashmiri Muslim as well. Even from 90s till date, there are almost 47,000 Kashmiris who got killed by the Pakistan-sponsored terrorists, and nobody dare to question them. And the world community is silent over them. And the thing is, they are killing each and every Kashmiris on the name of Nizam-ul-Mustafa, on the name of Azadi. And the thing is, if we will not question them, and tomorrow, if they have killed my family yesterday, tomorrow it can be anyone else. And it's the responsibility of the world community to think over it, that who is the prime responsibility and who is the funding these terror outfits. And the thing is, Pakistan is taking the aid from the many foreign countries on the name of different things. But the thing is, all the resources they are using it for the terror activities. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing your experiences with us. It was a delight to hear such a first-hand experience directly from you. Next, I would like to call upon Mr. Vikas Reyna, presently serving as the Vice President at Niche Software Solutions Private Limited. He is an alumnus of University of Pune. He has 14 years of profound experience in sales and business development in software industry, and a victim of terrorism, to enlighten us with the challenges faced by him as a victim. Over to you, sir.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Am I audible? Is this fine?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me. I want to thank GCTC group for inviting me and to this esteemed panel as a victim of terror. In fact, our whole community is victim of terror. I am a Kashmiri Pandit, and I am a man in exile for last 30 years. Although when I left, I was 10 years old. So this is about my father, and who was killed by terrorists in 1997. My father was a principal. This is a story about a person who dedicated his whole life for educating people and creating that kind of atmosphere in those places where education was doomed and terrorism was booming. See, my father was initially posted in Kargil, and after 3 years he was supposed to come back. And in J&K there's a norm: if you serve at remote places, then you get posting of your choice. But my father was very young at that point of time, and he was denied that choice, and he was sent to Ghul. Ghul is a place which is a remote place, and it was a very terrorist-prone place at that point of time. It is Ramban district. It was Ramban district. So my father, I remember my father used to go by foot 25 kilometers as a principal of a higher secondary school and all that. And when he joined, there were only 100 kids who were studying there, because it was very terrorist prone area. But after 2 years, he enrolled almost 500 kids in that school. And he created an atmosphere of education which was actually very difficult for terrorists to digest, because Hizbul Mujahideen at that point of time was very active on those places and all. So it was a night of 15th July that my father was going back to work, and he was in a bus nearly 7 kilometers before their school. The bus was stopped, and there were terrorists in army uniforms, and they particularly, when they entered the bus, they said, "Who are Hindus in this bus?" So they selected the Hindus, and there were 6 or 7 Hindus in that bus, and there was my father, and there were 2 of his colleagues. My father's name is Ashok Kumar Rana, and 2 of his colleagues were Ravindra Kabu and Sushil Pandit. So they were pulled down, and they were selected. 6 of them were kept on one side, and others were kept on other side who were non-Hindus. And it was told that our commander wants to talk to them, to the principal Saab and others. And 4 people were taken, and they were shot dead. I saw my father's body with 11 bullets. And it's very painful at that point of time. I was very young. But more painful, I want to stress here, more painful was that happened. Major pain is that our struggle and was never recognized by any of the organization in India or outside India. Justice was never delivered. So can someone believe, if there were hundreds of Kashmiri Pandits who were killed, there was not a single conviction? Till date, there is not a single conviction. So this is very difficult for us. There is no reconciliation for us. 2 years back, I decided to work on these things. So I filed a PIL reopening my father's case, which is this time in High Court of Jammu. I filed one more PIL. There was a dreaded terrorist who killed almost 20
Shreya, I guess Sir Vikas Reyna sir is having some connectivity issues. We can go further.
Okay. Next, I would like to extend my warm welcome to Dr. Shushma Shala, gynecologist and an obstetrician and a victim of terrorism, and shed some light on your story of being a victim. Over to you, ma'am.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank this Global Counter-Terrorism Council for inviting me to speak on something which is very close to my heart. I am directly a victim of terrorism. As Mr. Vikas, who was speaking before me, just like he lost his father, I also lost my father. But 7 years before him, I lost my father in 1990. I would like to start with the quote, "Flowers are silent, peace is violent, tears are frozen because massacres are chosen." So namaste from this side. I am Dr. Sushma Shala, representing the persecuted, victimized and forcibly evicted Kashmiri Hindu community from Kashmir. As we all are remembering the victims of terrorism today, I am here as a voice of all those people who got killed because of jihadi militancy in Kashmir. My father, who was working in intelligence wing of J&K police, he was martyred because he was doing his job, and his job was that the guys who were going across the border for arms training, he was keeping a keen watch on them and he was passing the information. That was his job. Though he had received threats which the family was unaware of, he had received threats that he has to stop this if he wants to live. And then what happened? He didn't tell us anything. And suddenly, one fine day on 1st of May, he was kidnapped. He was basically dragged from the bus. He was kidnapped. And then he was taken to a village, which is a village in Kasipura village in the border district of Kupwara, where he was posted. And he was taken there. And he was held captive for 3 to 4 hours. And those 3 to 4 hours, what was done to him, even humanity will be put to shame. His nails were pulled, his teeth were pulled, his bones were broken while he was still alive. They wanted some information from him, which he refused to give. Frustrated, the terrorists dragged him outside. They tried to hang him from a tree. But as he was very well built, so they could not hang him. And eventually, they shot him dead. What pains me more is that the people from neighboring villages came forward to witness this all, this brutality of his torture and his death, his killing in fact. They came forward and they were witnessing this without even a single soul coming forward to help him. An unarmed man who was subjected to the worst form of brutality. I was very young and my brother was not even 5 years old at that time. So you can imagine the amount of mental torture that we have suffered at the hands of terrorism. Why? Because my father was working for his country. Why? Because my father had a different faith. I think one gentleman from Kashmir said that it is Pak-sponsored terrorism that has spoiled lives and families in Kashmir. Exactly. That has spoiled lives in Kashmir. That has forced us, because whenever there is an incident of terrorism, it is never that it just swallows one life. It swallows the whole family. It swallows the friends. It swallows the family. In the case of my father, when I saw his body, what was done to his body, that has left such a deep impact in my brain and heart that I'm nurturing a sort of proud flesh which is refusing to heal from the past 30 years. And one gentleman said that we should not go for revenge, we should go for justice. I'm still waiting for justice from the past 30 years. I have not got justice. In fact, I don't know what has happened to my case. I don't know what has happened to my case. Like now Mr. Vikas said that he has filed an PIL. I have filed an RTI and I'm waiting for an answer. 2 RTIs have been refused. They have been returned back, saying that we don't have the details. So we had to send many details from this side. And still, after 30 years, the uncertainty, not the closure of the case, the uncertainty is there. And worst part is that the truth in my father's case has remained silent, because the witnesses that those were present there, they have turned deaf, mute and blind. They are not responding to any question, any query, and nobody's coming forward to you a witness. So terrorism has destroyed many families. It is the biggest enemy of mankind. I hope someday that we live in a world where there is no terrorism. We start living in a world where we respect and coexist with other religions. You cannot kill a person because that person is not towing your line of ideology or is not from your faith. That does not give you the right to kill that person. I hope and I pray that someday this world is free of terror and we are able to breathe free air and are able to drink free water and are able to live on free land which is free from terror. I hope from the past 30 years. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for coming up and sharing your heartfelt experiences with us. Such experiences really touched and moved all of us. Thank you, ma'am. Now I would kindly request Vikas Reyna, sir, to continue because there was some connectivity issue. Over to you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Shreya. So I was saying, just Sushma ji said what I wanted to say is that it is not terrorism at that point of time. It is the justice which is not delivered to us. So it took me 6 years to find the papers of my father through various RTIs so that I would be able, I will prepare my case so strong that it doesn't get rejected or it doesn't have any repercussions in higher courts. So after 6 years, then I filed the PIL. So 2 years of struggle. I'll be fighting this fight. This is not for me only or my father. This is for our whole community. The thing is that we have never got justice. Hundreds were killed and there was no conviction. There are no cases. As she also said, there's no papers. Her father's death, there's no papers. No documentation has been done. FIRs are not done. So can you imagine the amount of suppression and amount of non-recognition of our sufferings and miseries? It is immense. It's huge. So I want to request all the, I saw there are some authorities from the government also here. I want to request them that you should assist these things, because every battle we cannot take gun in our hand. So we have to fight it legally, and for legally, government has to comply with us. Government has to listen to us and provide us those parameters where we can provide us those avenues where we can fight legally and get justice. It's for everybody. All the Kashmiris, more than 800 Kashmiris were killed. None of them, there's no conviction, there are no cases, nothing is happening. So my request to everybody is that please help people legally so that they can get justice. It is a kind of, we need a closure. Everything needs a closure. My father was killed because, particularly because he was a Kashmiri Pandit, and rightly he was from a different faith. He didn't toe that line, so he was killed. But for last 30 years, it has been killing us every day because there is no justice for us. There was one journalist who was from, I guess he said that justice is very important. Right, it is very important, but you have to create that kind of atmosphere where justice can be delivered. So nothing has happened. Even there's no, not a single SIT which has happened on the genocide of Kashmiri Pandits. Can you imagine this thing? 5 lakh Kashmiri Pandits leaving their place, 800, there were rapes, kidnaps, killings, nothing has been done. As if we don't exist. So that is my point of view. Obviously, terrorism has destroyed whole world and it is destroying whole world. We have to fight it out. And for victims of terror, we need justice. We need closure. I hope people will listen to us and do give us our dues. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this platform. Jai Hind. Thanks.
Thank you so much for engaging with us today. Very true words spoken by Vikas Reyna, sir. May justice prevail. It was a pleasure hearing from you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, I would like to introduce you to Professor I.K. Bhatt. Professor Bhatt is a resource person on accreditation and staff development in the country and has conducted several dozen training programs in teaching pedagogy across the country. Now, I would like to invite Professor I.K. Bhatt, sir, to share your views with us.
Thank you very much, Ashi, for introducing me. I am privileged to listen to, in fact, Shekhar Dutt Saab, Major Chatterjee, Mr. Singhvi, who basically talked about many ideal things. Yes, we would like every situation to be ideal, but with us, it is not so actually. And they probably cannot think also the way Sajid thinks, the way Sushma thinks, the way I think, or the way Rana thinks. Probably they need to understand and put themselves in our shoes, and then and only then they will be able to understand the pain which we are going through. I am, first of all, let me also say that I must express my heartfelt gratitude to the Global Counter-Terrorism Council for providing me this an opportunity to apprise you and the esteemed members how our family suffered the trauma at the hands of terrorists. I am a Kashmiri Hindu. We are commonly called as Kashmiri Pandits, in fact. One more thing that I would like to apprise, that there are thousands of similar tragedies that occurred to Kashmiris, both Pandits as well as to Muslims. And each family has a story to tell about how they suffered at the hands of terrorists. I hope that the esteemed listeners can understand our plight of how we suffered for being peace-loving community and being the nationalists in our country. This is the reward which has been given to us. I shall also try to give the chain of events that subsequently led to this, our displacement from our state, from our homeland. I don't want to call myself refugee. Refugee means who once, like a bird, he goes there and comes back. I am not like that. I have been displaced forever actually from that place. I lost my mother. Her name was Prabhavati, and that was the first case of terrorism who died in because of these terrorists. Even after 3 decades, my family finds it very difficult to reconcile with it. My mother, and I'm not looking at the revenge. I'm not looking at any reward. I'm not looking at even compensation. But nobody to even acknowledge it. As Rana said, or the Sushma said, we are not being even considered as human beings, in fact. My mother was a simple lady to the core, actually, with a very high emotional and spiritual quotient. And at the same time, she was very disciplinarian. I had just completed my studies from IIT Kanpur and had taken a job at Lucknow. And my parents used to visit me during winter months to avoid the winter of Kashmir, actually. Usually they would come in the month of around November, December, and would go back in the March. to take care of their routine back at home, in fact, in our village. That year too also they came, stayed with me, and on 11th of March 1989, till then no death had taken place. 11th March, they went back to Kashmir. They stayed in Punjabi Mohalla Hari Singh High Street, where my uncle stays, for 2 days. And that Mohalla that was completely a Hindu Mohalla. That is why they called it Punjabi Mohalla. A lot of Punjabis used to stay there. On 14th March, after staying there for 2 days, they planned to go back to our home, located at Nagam in Chadora, Tehsil. My sister and my brother-in-law came to pick them up in their own vehicle from the place of stay. As soon as all four were coming out of the lane, a bomb that was planted there was detonated and the building came tumbling down. A large portion of it fell on my mother and she was severely injured. She suffered head injury and went into coma immediately. Fortunately, other members, my father, my sister, and my brother-in-law, who were a few steps ahead of her, did not get seriously injured, though some splinters hit them also. My sister and brother-in-law, both of them are doctors. They picked up my mother and took her to SMHS hospital, where doctors, after looking at their condition, referred them to Sher-e Kashmir Institute of Medical Sciences located at Sohra. Without wasting any time, they immediately reached Sohra. And on reaching Sohra, the surgeon who was supposed to operate avoided his responsibility and kept going from one room to another room and kept hiding actually. My sister and my brother-in-law tried to locate him, but he was not traceable for the whole day. Right from 11 a.m. till 5:30 p.m., he did not attend to my mother. This is the pain actually. At around 5:30, when the doctors for next shift came, one of the doctors who was our relative recognized my sister and brought the surgeon from somewhere and forced him to operate on my mother. I was in Lucknow and received the message on the morning of 15. This had happened on 14 because the communication was not so simple those days. And I got the message on 15th morning. We immediately rushed from Lucknow and reached on 16th to Srinagar. We straight went to Sohra and found that my mother was in ICU on a life support system, and she was not responding to the treatment as my sister said. Despite all attempts, we could not revive her, and damage which was caused by the impact of the blast, one, and subsequently due to the deliberate delay in operating upon her, almost by 6 hours by the doctor, proved fatal, and she could not come out of her state of coma. We came to know later that terrorists had phoned the hospital not to attend to the patient who get injured in these blasts, and they called it Operation Topak. She left for her heavenly abode on 16th of April after staying there in coma for 1 month. She died on 16th of April and attained liberation. It was all over and all of us lost her forever. We took her to our native village, Nagam, for the last rites. As per police records, she died on March 14. When we inquired about, give us the details, they have given us that she died on 14, the day the bomb blast was there. They do not even know, nobody actually there, what has been said. In fact, what does it mean? RTI, no FIRs, nothing is there. And this is the pain actually which we are undergoing actually. Her killers remained untraced. This is what the police report says. Her killers remain untraced. Contrary to it, JKLF claimed through newspapers that they had implanted this bomb here in the Punjabi Mohalla Hari Singh High School. So therefore, even everyone knows who did it. Yet police says that the victims cannot be found. She was the first victim of terrorism, let me tell you. And after her death, the bomb blasts and the selective killings became so frequent. And many Kashmiri Pandits and other Hindus, and even later, the Muslims also lost their life, which probably could have been saved, in fact. I left for Lucknow. Now, another story I'll tell you. I left for Lucknow in the month of July, last week of July 1989, after about 3 months of her death. In August, my two sisters went to Nagam to meet my father. One of my old classmates came and told my sisters that please take him away with them, as otherwise we might lose him also. He told them that he has been put on the hit list of the terrorists. They forcibly brought him to Srinagar and sent him to Jammu, where my brother had shifted. A few months later, some locals came and looted all our belongings from our house, carrying the booty in 2 trucks, and burned the house to ensure that we do not come back to it. All this was done under the blind eyes of state as well as central government. And this is actually what is paining all of us, who did not pay any heed towards these eventualities. Had the government acted immediately, many lives could have been saved thereafter. Their silence and no action was responsible for encouraging terrorist activities and death of many innocent people. All such cases were never investigated, and culprits were allowed to operate as per their own design, and they would get orders from across the border. In fact, everyone knew it actually, except the government. They never acknowledged it. The terrorists would openly say that they want to establish Nizam-e-Mustafa, what Sajid said, in fact. And this is what is true story actually in the state. And they said that the state should be governed by Sharia rules because Muslims are in majority there. The terrorists moved freely and were showcasing their weapons actually. And nobody would take a note of it. The Kalashnikovs and AK-47 was an open thing, and they had made Kashmir a hell actually under the shade of this terrorists, especially for non-Muslims who were the first targets for them. They killed scholars, they killed intellectuals, they killed innovators, they killed activists, they raped ladies and then murdered them brutally, removing their inner parts, putting it on the dead bodies. It was creating an environment of terror for all of us actually. And then subsequently in the same year, before the exodus actually started for Hindus, on 14th September, Tiklal Tiplu was assassinated. Again, people were saying that we have been able to kill one more person. The victory, in fact, signs were shown. On 1st November 1809, in fact, same year, Nilkant Ganju was shot dead in the Hari Singh High Street itself, which is very close to the High Court, because he had sentenced one JKLF militant Maqbul Bhatt for his crimes actually. During this period, in fact, a lot of posters came in newspapers and we said Reliv, Saliv or Galiv, which means either you convert yourself to Islam or leave this valley for us, or be ready to die, leaving behind girls and ladies. This was the posters which were pasted on the doors of Hindus, and also which was newspaper, this advertisements were given like this. Nobody took note of it. On 19th January, everybody knows what happened after that. The announcements came from mosques, and this seemed to be the last night for every Hindu, in fact, that day, because the way they were harassed, the way they were mentally tortured, all of them, in fact, were ready to die that night. Many, I have met hundreds of people, and many of them said that we had thought that we had kept kerosene and the matches ready for us, that in case they come here, we will burn ourselves. That ladies said. And this is the tragedy, and nobody recognizes it. Nobody acknowledges it. Most of the Hindus moved out of the valley during that night and subsequent. And then they had a narration to say that the governor told us to move away. If that was wrong, if that was true, then why did they kill Lasakol, who was the senior director of Doordarshan? He was assassinated on 13th of April. On 14th of April, Al-Safa again published the same warning for Hindus to leave the valley. Sarla Bhatt, on April 25th, she was a nurse in Sora Medical Institute. She was gang raped by JKLF militants and was later killed on April 25th. 29th, Sarvanand Premi, a highly renowned poet and the intellectual person, was murdered by his own students outside his house, actually. Another heartless, Veerji Bhatt, from the same village where I live, was killed on May 13, 1990. He was sprayed with bullets on the road, and he was just standing there, actually. So there were people who were doing it, and they knew what they are actually trying to do. On June 4, Girja Tiku, a teacher, was abducted, raped, and then shred to pieces on an electrical saw. Imagine what was, she was alive and she was torn into pieces. August 90, Satish Tiku was killed. And so many things happened. This was between 1989 and 1990, I'm talking about. After that, it became a normal thing for them to do this. So they can.
In the meantime, I would like to invite Major Siddharth Chatterjee, sir, to have some opinion to share it with us.
Sure. Thank you very much. You know, that is why the United Nations has today as a day to mark people that have been affected by the scourge of terrorism. In my own battalion, I've felt the after effects of it, which I carried with me till date, with the loss of some of the finest officers and soldiers. The bigger point I come back to is nobody should ever have to live under the threat of terror, whether it's by terrorist organizations or state-sponsored terror or terror from within the state. Nobody. And it is therefore absolutely important that our collective resolve must still remain pegged towards advancing the prevention agenda. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said something very remarkable. He said, the world is in pieces and we need world peace. After the Second World War, close to 75 million people as of date today are fleeing violence, are fleeing terrorism, are fleeing instability, are fleeing challenges to the climate. But when a state decides that it can prevent, I have seen this happen here in Kenya. There's a neighborhood called Kamakunji, where the member of parliament of that particular neighborhood, which has many ethnic Kenyan Somalis and Somalis settled there, had a bombing episode where he lost the use of his right leg and severe injuries he had. And yet it is the same individual that went to work within that community and transformed it. In fact, in 2019, when the Secretary General came to Kenya, to Nairobi, for the Africa-wide Prevention of Violent Extremism conference, we took the Secretary General there. Once the hotbed of terror has now been turned into a place where young people are employed, are educated, are looking at opportunities and advancing themselves. So political will is going to be the most important character in the prevention agenda. It's easy. Throw in the army here, throw in the police there. Those are easy decisions. And the army and police will follow those instructions. But this is where we need a civil service, which is far more cognizant of the realities of prevention. I have seen prevention work in some of the worst hard-hit areas of Kenya. And I just think that it is something that we need to now globally embrace, because the kinetic energy, the hard power, the sheer scale of violence we are applying to it is not giving us the solutions. We've been trying it for many, many years. There has to be another way. There should be no reason why a single Kashmiri Pandit should be living outside of Kashmir, beyond their free choice. Never. But I recall 1998. I was a young soldier fighting in Sri Lanka. When Kashmir fell apart, we know what happened. We know what happened to the elections. There are consequences. When you roughshod over communities and their genuine political aspirations, there are consequences for it. So everybody will then take advantage of that situation. It's not about naming a neighbor or whoever. We have to create an environment which is conducive, which embraces human rights, which embraces equality, which brings everybody together. Ladies and gentlemen, when you hear me speak like this, please understand that I have seen the sheer scale of violence as a soldier too. Witnessed it. And as a soldier, as a former soldier, as one that was decorated for gallantry by the President of India, I think organizations like GCTC should be able to inform public policy towards the prevention agenda, because ultimately it is about equality, it is about justice, it is about leaving no one behind, it is about a sense of hope, because no human being, regardless of their caste, their religion, their background, is born with a sword or a gun in his hand. It's how his or her environment shapes it to be. Over to you.
Thank you very much, sir, for sharing your great knowledge with us. Now, I would like Professor I.K. Bhatso, I would like to continue.
So, so therefore, after that, they put those notices, in fact, and all such cases were, as I said, were never investigated, and they wanted to have established Nizam-e-Mustafa in the state and have Sharia rule to govern the state. As the terrorists moved freely and were showcasing the weapons, in fact, the AK-47, the Kalashnikovs, and made Kashmir a hell under the shadow of this terrorism for non-Muslims, in fact. They killed many scholars, they killed intellectuals, they killed innovators, they killed activists, raped ladies, and then murdered them brutally, removing the inner parts and putting it on the dead bodies. It was creating an environment of terror for all Hindus, in fact. 14th September, because it was a chain of events which was happening actually. Tikal Al-Jablu was killed. Neelkant Gaju was killed in the street of Hari Singh High Street. During this period, again, the notice came that the notices were pasted on the houses of Hindus, Relive, Saliv or Galiv, which means either convert to Islam or run away from this place or be ready to die, leaving behind girls and ladies. This was the advertisement which came in Aftab newspaper on 4th of January 1990. This was published, in fact, and yet nobody was taking note of it. On 19th January, everyone knows that what happened actually. So all of the Kashmiri Pandits were dead scared about the what was happening on 19th of January 1990, after almost 9 months of my death of my mother actually. And many Kashmiris whom I have met, many girls said that we were ready to burn ourselves had they come inside our houses actually. Most of the Hindus moved subsequently outside. The narration which was given was that the governor told us to go away. Had that been so, then why did they kill later also? On 13th of February, station director of Doordarshan was killed. Laskul was killed in February. In April, Al Safa again gave that advertisement. Another newspaper gave again the same advertisement. Sarala Bhatt, a nurse in Sovra Medical Institute, was abducted. She was gang raped by JKLF militants and was killed on April 25th. In fact, almost the same period, the people, four Indian Air Force Jawans were killed, pilots were killed by JKLF, and they danced on their dead bodies and said that nobody will touch them. So on 29th of April, Sarvanand Premi, a renowned poet and intellectual, was murdered by his own students outside his house, and his eyes were removed actually. Another heartless killing took place in our own village, Nagam, where a Veerji Bhatt, a young junior engineer, was sprayed with bullets on the road, and everybody was watching it. Everybody knows that who did it, yet nobody is able to, they have not been able to write even an FIR for that. And it was in presence of the police post, which is very close to that Thana there. The Girja Tiku, a teacher from Bandipur, was abducted. She was raped and she was shred to pieces on an electrical saw. You can imagine the brutality. She was still alive and she was cut into 2 pieces on an electrical saw. 11th August, Satish Tipu, Hadainath Manchu, and hundreds of such people, as has been already said, were brutally killed. Now, these were the individual cases. When they found that the individual cases are not helping them anyway, they started mass killing. Padgam, Sangrampura, 7 Hindus were killed together. In Vandhama, 24 Hindus, including children, 3 years old children, were killed by these terrorists. Prankot, 25 Hindus were beheaded. They were made to stand on their in a line, and their heads were cut off. Amarnath Yatra, 30 pilgrims. Chiti Singh Pora, 36 Sikhs were killed, and many such things happened. Actually, there are dozens of such events which have taken place. Now, why I'm saying is, in all these cases, the terrorists who knew the victim very closely, who recognized them, were the people who ultimately killed them. And they were trained across the border. They were trained by the militants and people who had sneaked into Kashmir from across the border. They had trained them. I'm just mentioning it to make it clear that it was a part of a bigger design that above killings were done. Every displaced Kashmiri Pandit wishes to go back to Kashmir, to our own roots, and hope someday we will be back to our homes safe and sound. And remaining outside the valley has definitely affected us, taken us away from our roots. We have suffered psychologically. Kindly understand, we have suffered physically, we have suffered mentally, we have suffered financially, we have suffered socially, we have suffered culturally. And our children have suffered as far as education is concerned. Ours is the only community which lives as refugees in our own motherland. Despite living in unlivable conditions, continue to provide the best possible education to our children, making them capable of contributing at the national level and also at the global level in all possible ways. This is what we are doing. Kindly support us in these things. Don't leave us, because we need support, we need sympathy, we need that dignity back. The government as well as the judiciary, in giving a blind, deaf, dumb response to the plight of the Kashmiri Pandits following their mass exodus from Jammu and Kashmir, is really pitiable. Terming it as a direct fallout of the mass-scale internal genocide and ethical cleansing, we demand that what happened with our community must be acknowledged as a genocide. As was said by Vikas Reyna ji, that this is what we want. We want that it should be recognized. Nobody is recognizing even today also. The governments, though we say that new government is there, they are interested in doing something. Nothing has been done, let me tell you, to recognize the plight of plight and the conditions through which we have gone. We have not got justice actually. We do not want revenge. We do not want killing, but we want justice. That we want our our prestige back. Despite the tons of evidence against these killers, the terrorists, the notorious terrorists like Yasin Malik, Javed Mir, Bita Karate, who have killed people publicly, hundreds of people, not only Hindus, even Muslims, they are moving free. In fact, one of them, the Yasin Malik, was a special guest of our previous Prime Minister and would stay with him. This is the plight which we are facing. This is actually what hurts us. We will continue to request the global community to help us in bringing back the prestige which we have lost due to these brutalities committed by these terrorists. We will continue to demand justice and seek action against murderers, rapists, and looters. This is what we want. Look at the Kasab was provided biryani, and our children have not been even provided schools. Had it not been Bal Thackeray who provided us education, otherwise we would have been maybe more terrorists would have been there from other communities also. But we are nationalists. We are for development. We do not want revenge. We want our prestige back, and we want justice. That is what I wanted to say. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your views and experience with us. It was really a good session full of information. Also, I would like to thank all the speakers who are with us here and for your valuable knowledge and insightful experiences. We are really thankful. Now that concludes a remarkable, memorable, and knowledgeable event. On behalf of Global Counter-Terrorism Council, I promise you that this may be the end of today's session, but undoubtedly is a new beginning. Thank you, and thank you very much for all of you.
Thank you. Thanks.